Dave Nicolai. I'm with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I want to welcome you today to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're happy that you've joined us here for this session. This particular session is on navigating the corn maze and implications on new strategies, research, and production agronomic items as well. Today is February 12th, 2025. So again, we welcome you to attending this particular webinar, which is being recorded and available for playback later on. These sessions are brought to you by the University of Minnesota Extension, along with generous support from the University of Minnesota Agronomic Department and the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, also the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council, along with the Soybean Research and Promotion Council. Our guests today are Dr. Jeff Coulter, and Jeff is the University of Minnesota corn agronomist in University of Minnesota Extension. Also, we're going to have joining us a little bit later, Ed Usset. Ed is the grain marketing economist with the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Farm Financial Management. And finally, rounding out our session today will be Adam Birr. Adam is Executive Director of the Minnesota Corn Growers Association. A little bit of housekeeping measures before we start with the program. We'll have an opportunity for you to input questions, and they will be down at the bottom of your screen here in Zoom. As many of you are familiar with this already, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is where you can indicate any information with that. There's also a chat box. We like to reserve those for technical issues if you have one, and it'll also be for announcements from our standpoint in terms of links and helpful references as we go through with that. When we're done with the program today, there'll be a very short 3-minute survey. You'll have an opportunity to fill that out at the end of the session. And also, as a bonus for those folks that need certified crop advisors, continuing education units will have a QR code that'll pop up on your screen, and you'll have an opportunity to scan that and obtain the certified crop advisor CEUs primarily in the crop production area with that. Again, there'll be options for you to look at in terms of information that'll be in the chat, and we'll talk about, again, links that will be helpful with that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Jeff Coulter. We had some questions that came in, Jeff, earlier last week already for the session. You've had an opportunity to look at those, and a lot of them are related to corn production and corn management. And so I'm going to give you the helm of the ship, so to speak, here, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions as we go through the program. So if you want to set it up for the slideshow portion on your end so we can see the full image, that would be great. And I think that is about all I had. So take it away, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to cover some of the questions that we had last week from the Strategic Farming attendees, and a lot of them related to production questions and trying to cut costs. So today in my part of the session, I'm just going to kind of go through the questions and give some answers. And if there's some time at the end, we can kind of have a little bit of a question and answer. But the first question was, what are some tips for strip tilling corn on corn in 22-inch rows? So I consulted with Jody DeYoung-Hughes and Jeff Vetch, who are extension people who have done a lot of research on this topic. And I came up with a couple different options. But there are a few things that are common throughout. One of them is to think about, with narrow rows, typically a Coulter type strip till machine works better than a shank type unit. In addition, it is generally best if the corn stalks are left standing and not chopped or shredded, because that allows them to flow through the toolbar a little better. But even with them standing, it's still going to be a challenge with the narrow rows. Another thing is to consider turning off the chopping corn head, or to set it to minimize the amount of chopping. And if you have a chopping head, run it as high as possible through the field. In addition, row cleaners may be needed on the strip till unit, but sometimes the row cleaners get tangled in the nearby rows if the rows are left standing. In addition, it's really important to perform that strip tillage when the soil conditions are ideal and not too dry and not too wet. And because of this, and because it's a special challenge in narrow rows, one may need to consider stopping other field activities in order to get this strip tillage done under ideal soil conditions. Another suggestion is to definitely till in between the old rows, and that's a must even if in 30-inch rows. From a fertility standpoint, generally no big changes with row width. Another option that's a slightly different than what I just described is to do your strip tillage in the fall, but then do one pass in the spring with an inline Coulter unit to clean off and freshen up the strips. And that can be beneficial. There's been previous research that investigated strip tillage in corn on corn throughout southern Minnesota. It was a big extension project done in the early 2000s, and they compared different tillage systems, generally moldboard plow or disc grip system versus strip till. And in some of the cases, the strip till did just as good as the moldboard plow or disc grip, but in some cases it didn't. And when they looked into the data a little bit closer, they found that the farmers that were using a second pass in the spring to kind of freshen up the berms, and get the residue off of them, those were the farms where the yields of the strip till were equivalent to those in a more intensive tillage system. So a second pass in the spring to freshen up the berms can be important, and that can be helpful. And it may be more helpful in continuous corn and on fine textured soils. Now, an alternative approach to what I've just described would be to, again, don't use a chopping corn head because with that, the residue gets really shredded up and it blows around quite a bit. In addition, following that, consider doing vertical till in the fall, just to kind of get that residue broken down and kind of pushed into the soil a little bit. Then do a fall strip till pass. And according to Jody, she says that generally works better if the strip till unit has multiple toolbars, and allowing that residue to be able to feed through it easier. And then again, in the spring, consider doing one pass in the spring with an inline Coulter unit to kind of freshen up those strips. So that's kind of the suggestions that we have for strip tilling corn on corn in narrow rows. Another thing that we kind of want to consider here is a question that we have that's about yield data available for hybrid selection. And the attendee last week was asking about, is there reliable, unbiased yield data available, and are there big data sources? Well, yes, there are. Probably the most well-known one is the FIRST program. They test corn hybrids and soybean varieties all across the U.S. They even do a little bit of silage testing in, I think it's Pennsylvania. Another good source is the Minnesota Corn Growers Association website. They have county trials located throughout the state, and they have a really good tool on there that allows you to kind of choose the hybrids you're interested in and get aggregated data and aggregated results. So that can be important because we know that if we're trying to pick the hybrids that are going to perform good next year, there's a better chance that they're going to perform well if we're choosing hybrids that have performed well over multiple locations this year. In addition, there is also information available from universities and co-ops. So that's available too, but oftentimes those sources of data don't have like selection tools available to them. I think a good general guideline is to try to find hybrid trial data from as many sources as you can that are of somewhat similar growing environments to what you have, and then try to look at hybrids that are performing in the top 20% of those trials. And if you're choosing hybrids that are consistently in the top 20% of the trials you're looking at, it's a pretty good chance that next year they're going to, if you choose those hybrids and plant them next year, there's a pretty good chance that they are going to perform better than average when compared to all of the hybrids considered. So it's kind of a consistency thing and looking kind of for the top performers and trying to find them and choose them. There are other sources of information too that also may be like big data sources, but oftentimes one needs to be a member of the network or pay a fee to unlock the data. So for example, Farmers Business Network. That's an option. It's like $500 a year. There's other options as well. Like in the Eastern Corn Belt, they use this thing called My Farm Solutions. It's a similar type of platform. There's others available as well, some larger and some smaller and more local or regional in their aspect. In addition, sometimes farmers may work with a crop consultant company, and they may be able to pool the results of the yields of their growers from a large area and share the results with you. So there's a lot of different ways to go about this, but I think it's kind of about trying to choose the hybrids that are, consistently top performers across multiple trials, and that's going to give you the best chance of success for the next year.
Jeff, one comment came in from one of the listeners that Farm Business Network is now free, but you have to contribute your own agronomic data to pull that other information out. So there's a contribution part of that as well. Just wanted to bring that up in terms of that. It's
Okay.
not totally free. You still have to contribute at least data to be accessed. So evidently that must be the case. I just wanted to bring that up. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Dave.
Yep.
Yeah, that's new information to me, so that's great. Okay, the next question is, what are the best areas to cut costs without hurting yield? And that's important as the crop prices are falling. And then the follow-up question is, what expenses should we cut first? Well, I would start by saying we don't want to skimp on weed control. For corn, it's typically you're going to need a pre-emergence herbicide followed by a post-herbicide. Yeah, we got to get those weeds under control. Another option is fertilizers. So in the chat, I put a link to an article that was from the Farm Progress online magazine. And in that article, they interviewed Brad Carlson, and it was based on some information, some data that he looked at, the most profitable farmers in Minnesota compared to the least profitable group. And he came up with a few suggestions on ways to cut some fertilizer costs. And I'll just kind of go through those because I thought they were really good. You can start by simply following the U of M guidelines for fertilizer. Typically, the university guidelines are a little lower than what some farmers or crop advisors are recommending. But I think in most cases, you're going to get similar yield comparable to if you're applying a higher rate. So I think, starting by going with the U of M fertilizer guidelines would be a good start to trying to reduce your expenses. And you may be able to reduce your expenses by quite a lot. And that could be especially important in this year. With minimal risk to yield loss. You may lose a little yield, but I don't think it's going to be substantial. In addition, another suggestion that Brad Carlson had was thinking about the application methods for your N rates. So, for example, thinking about when you're applying that nitrogen. So, applying in the spring rather than the fall would be important to trying to get best use of those nutrients. In addition, thinking about whether you need a split N application. In years like this, when we had a lot of rainfall, the split applications generally were advantageous. But in most cases, there hasn't been a huge advantage to split application of N when compared to just applying all of the N pre-plant. So that may be something to think about as well. And then also going back to the suggestion on using U of M fertilizer guidelines, if one is applying P and K at rates of crop removal, that can get quite expensive, and it may not be necessary if the soil tests are already high or very high, at least in the short term. So I think there's some great opportunities to cut costs, especially with P and K, simply by going with the annual U of M fertilizer guidelines, where you're just fertilizing for this year's crop. Another suggestion that Brad had was thinking about whether premium fertilizers are needed. So, there are some fertilizers that are marketed to have better efficiency, better uptake for P and K. That may not be something that is really important to spend extra money on this year. Now, for nitrogen, that's a little bit of a different story, where some of the slow release nitrogen fertilizers and stuff, can definitely be beneficial in a right application timing scenario. But for P and K, generally, the traditional sources of P and K are just fine. Another thing to think about, according to this article, is, what kind of fertilizer advisory technology are you paying for? So, for example, some like drone mapping, in-season soil sampling, tissues testing, are you using this? If so, how much does it cost? And are you using the results to change your management practices? And if you're not changing your practices based on this information, then it may not really be necessary, especially in a year when, you know, prices are down and the costs are still high. So these are just kind of some basic things that one might want to kind of consider with this. And there are some other options as well, definitely, to cut costs. One of them is seeding rate. So we've done a lot of planting rate trials in Minnesota where we've compared different planting rates. Over the last 3 years, I've done a lot of trials comparing 34,000 versus 38,000 seeds per acre, and I've not once found a difference in yield. That's been in continuous corn. In addition, Yushin Miao, who is the director of the Precision Ag Center, him and his team have done a lot of on-farm trials where they've compared planting rates throughout the field, doing variable rate planting, and have replicated planting rates throughout the field. And in most cases, the optimum planting rate has been around 32,000 seeds per acre, which is substantially lower than what's recommended by industry and what most agronomists are recommending. So I think that, in a lot of cases, growers can cut their planting rates down to 34,000. They can save a little money. It's not going to sacrifice yield. There may be a few small areas in the field where the optimum planting rate is higher, but they're not going to be large areas. And there's probably going to be substantial areas in the field where the optimum planting rate may be a little lower than that. So contradictory to what most people say, 34,000 should be sufficient. And corn is a crop that's able to flex its ear size a little bit. So if the planting rate is a little low in some areas, the ears get bigger, they can somewhat compensate for that. Another thing to think about is foliar fungicide and insecticide. In years when the crop prices are high, we see a lot of this applied prophylactically. The farmers and agronomists make a plan at the beginning of the year that they're going to apply it. They apply it without any scouting. Basically, if you want to cut costs without hurting yield, then you want to be only applying those things that are needed. And if one is applying fungicide and insecticide without scouting, without looking at extension thresholds for what the disease pressure or insect pressure needs to be before that application should be made, well, then those are things that one could consider cutting. Another final thing I just kind of want to mention as a way to cut costs is tillage. So, I've made a couple trips down to Iowa area this year, and basically I've looked really carefully at the fields all the way from the Twin Cities south, and 95% of the soybean fields that were in soybean stubble have had some form of tillage done to them, either like a chisel plow, a light disc, or even like a manure injection or something like that. And from a yield standpoint, it's really unnecessary to be doing tillage in the fall on soybean stubble. It allows you to get into the field maybe a couple days earlier in the spring, but it causes a lot of soil erosion. And in many cases, from a yield standpoint, it's not necessary. So I know this is a little late for this year, but if one wanted to cut tillage, a good way to start would be basically getting rid of that fall tillage on soybean stubble and just doing the tillage in the spring. Typically, like one pass with a field cultivator in the spring on soybean stubble will produce maximum yield. So those are some ideas. With the question about what expenses to cut first, I mean, I would just go through the list that I talked about and think about the things that you're doing, and any of those on there are candidates for what to cut first. Obviously, going with the U of M fertilizer guidelines would be a great way to start cutting fertilizer costs. And then things like unnecessary pesticide applications, and then maybe looking at that 34,000 planting rate those may be some options. The next question that we have is, what about the minimal soil temperature for early corn planting? Typically, a mid 40 degrees and trending stable or trending upward. If it's the mid 40s and it's going to be trending downward due to an incoming cold front, then it's typically better to wait because that's going to cause some issues with corn emergence. And then related to that, we got a question about whether one should be planting soybean or corn first. And that comes out of some research from Wisconsin where they're really recommending to plant soybeans as early as possible. And I would say, based on what I've reviewed from that, that, if soil conditions are suitable and it's like mid-April and you're past your insurance date for planting soybeans, well, then it's fine to start planting soybeans first if you want to. But once it gets to about April 20th, you need to put the full focus on corn, get that corn in, and because once it gets to May 10th, the yield for delayed planting on corn really starts to get larger. So it's really important to get that corn planted by May 10th, but planting corn before April 20th rarely produces much benefit. The only benefit is that it helps you to get those last fields planted a little earlier and maybe possibly reduce the yield loss on those last planted fields. But if one is able to get their corn planted by May 10th or May 7th with no problem, then there's really no advantage to starting to plant earlier. And the reason people talk about planting soybeans early is because soybean typically handles early planting better than corn does. When we plant that corn very early and then we have some cool conditions, oftentimes it just kind of struggles and it looks pale and it just has a difficult time building a root system, where soybean tends to be able to withstand those early planting conditions a little better. So this unique suggestion that, plant soybeans really early if the conditions are right and the weather is looking nice, and then once you get to April 20, switch to corn, and then when you finish your corn, go back to soybeans. Some people are recommending that. It's a little different than what we're used to. I really question how much extra yield you're going to get on your soybeans, but if you want to try this, I think it's reasonable, but I don't think there's going to be a huge advantage for that, and I don't think there's also a huge advantage for planting corn super early. When we do the planting date trials for corn, almost always the highest yields are in that last week of April, first week of May, assuming the soil conditions are fit. If there's bad soil conditions, then obviously that's going to harm the yields. And for corn, also soil conditions are very important. And typically the soil conditions in that first planting window of the season are generally best. And after that, they get worse because it follows multiple raining and drying events. And oftentimes we end up planting into soils that are less than ideal. They're a little wet. And then the final question is the best production step a producer can take to improve profitability in 2025. Well, you only get one chance to plant. So you need to be timely and get the crop planted in good soil conditions to get a good stand. That's most important, especially for corn. And then think about where you can cut costs without sacrificing yield. And we talked about that earlier. And I think being timely and just producing a good crop so you got something to sell is going to be important. But then with that, try to cut some costs. So that's kind of everything I got today. And I'll turn it over to Dave.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Jeff. If you can stop sharing your screen for just a second and then hang on there. I'm going to go right over to talk to our other guest here on corn and bring in Ed Usset, as I introduced before. Ed is with the Center of Farm Financial Grain Marketing. And good morning, Ed. I think you're muted. So you want to unmute yourself on your end. There you go. Yeah, go right ahead. Can you hear me okay, Ed?
Yes, I can.
All right, super duper. You can change that if you want to go to your slideshow or your view so that you get the full screen on your end, if you know what I mean.
Sure. How about that?
That whatever works on your end, that sounds fine. And go right ahead. You've got the floor.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk a bit about trade, agriculture and trade. Don't want to spend a long time on it, but we need to think about it a bit. And then I would like to address old crop issues with a focus on corn and new crop pricing challenges with a focus on corn. I just want everyone to know there's a lot of trade talk right now, and I am not going to make bold predictions as to where this will go. Because right now it's a lot of talk, it's a lot of positioning. I'm not sure how serious we are one way or another. But if you want to know the impact that trade can have on prices, let's go back to the trade war of 2018. This shows you corn, soybean, and wheat prices in Minnesota. The corn prices are down in southwestern Minnesota. The corn and soybean prices are. The wheat prices are up in the Red River Valley. General prices in early May, we had 360 corn, 960 soybeans, give or take $6 wheat. We fell into a trade war in mid-May. 10 weeks later, by mid-July, corn and soybean prices were each down 20%, and wheat was down 15%. From where they were in early May 2018. Not a prediction, just a reminder of how trade can impact prices if it's done wrong. And just a reminder, I like doing this with every audience I visit with, just how important trade is to agriculture in the United States. And this is a 50-year look. I went back to 1974. And looked at the percent of the corn, soybeans, and wheat, the percent of our production that we exported. Now, in 1974, we exported 24% of our corn crop. That's projected to be 16% this year. Sounds like we're losing ground in corn. Not at all. We export more corn than anything. But we have introduced ethanol into the picture in the last 30 years. And that's taken a big chunk of our production now. Soybeans and wheat, 50 years ago, 35 and 43% of our production was exported. Very similar numbers this year. Those numbers have been the same for decades, people. I could go back to the 60s. I could go back 100 years in wheat, and we've always exported wheat. And the numbers are really 40 to 50%, but we're a little subdued this year. And we've been a grain export. We got this wonderful thing called the Corn Belt. We produce more than we can consume. We've been major exporters for years. Let's look at some things that have grown over the last few years. Pork. Did you know that this year we're projecting to export 25% of our pork products will be exported? Didn't exist 50 years ago. In fact, pork exports hardly existed 30 years ago. It's been a great growth story over the last 2 decades. Beef, we really didn't export beef until 10, 15, 20 years ago, and now 11% of our beef production is exported. 16% of our chicken production is exported. Hardly existed 20, 30 years ago. We got a lot at stake in trade. It's a big topic. I make no predictions about where this is going, but trade is important to agriculture. Now let's talk about old crop. I'd like to, for people listening, think about that grain you have in the bin, the stuff you harvested 3-4 months ago. You've got it in storage. It's not priced. You're wondering, will the price be better? We've had a nice post-harvest rally, particularly in the last 2 months, December and January. Cash corn prices are doing pretty good, well off their lows. And now the question I'm asking is, okay, I've got this corn in the bin. The price is up. The price is up pretty good. Should I continue to hold it unpriced, or should I take advantage of this? Well, I went back, as I want to do. These are cash prices now, average Iowa prices, and don't let the Iowa hang you up. We've got the same patterns here. But what I did is I noted the January high in 8 different years, this year being the 9th. What these years have in common is, just like this year, we've already had a big rally going into January. That is, we've had a strong post-harvest rally into January. So I asked myself, well, in these years, will this rally continue? And I don't mind saying two things. One, the AMJ high, that's April, May, June high, typically is higher than the January high. I'd say 8 out of 10 years, the odds are pretty strong. We're going to go even higher into April, May, June. However, my thought here is, hey, we've already had a big rally. Maybe that's it. Maybe these years are less likely to rally into the spring. And guess what I found out? Not true. All 8 of these years since the year 2000 that have had this strong rally post-harvest into January, every one of them saw even higher prices by April, May, June, cash prices. Some significantly higher, some modestly higher, but it makes me feel a little better about that grain in the bin. By the way, one thing hurting corn prices right now, they'd be even better, but basis has backed off on corn and soybeans. It's a new tax year, and that lower basis is simply telling me that buyers of corn, soybeans, and wheat are finding it easier to buy grain. Let's look ahead to new crop pricing now, 2025. I can tell you we've had a nice rally in new crop prices, but far from great, but we are 40 cents off our lows in corn, and that's good news. A similar format here. I'm looking at the January high, only this is not cash prices, people. This is Chicago Board of Trade December corn futures. So I've sort of shifted gears. And since 2004, over the last 21 years up to this year, the AMJ high was higher than the January high. And by the way, our January high was about 467. We went higher in 4 out of 5 years. Okay, 80% odds. Makes you feel good. I tell anyone who feels real good, remember this trade talk and all that, and where that could careen off the road. But nevertheless, all other things being equal, I like the chances for new crop prices to give us a better shot in April, May, June. By the way, I got this sent to me from a student of mine in my class, something put together by Crystal Valley Cooperative, looking at December corn prices versus the spring insurance price, which of course is based on the average of December corn in the month of February. And this analysis said that in all 20 of the last 20 years, December futures have found a way to trade above the February average at some point between March 1 and November 30th, all 20 years. Now, this is the high in December futures. It's always hard to pick the high, but it's encouraging to note that 20 for 20, we find a way to go a little higher than that, sometimes a lot higher, sometimes a little higher than that February average, which, by the way, is about 468 to date. We haven't settled it yet because we have a little more than half the month to go. By the way, 19 of those 20 years, that rally, that December high was at least 20 cents higher than the February average. Soybeans, similar format. We're looking at new crop soybeans, November soybean futures. I'm looking at the January high in one column, the April, May, June high in the next column. And sure enough, 2 out of 3, soybeans are not as obedient as corn, never are. But 2 out of 3 years, we found a way to go higher in the April, May, June period. And that's encouraging. And tells me, by the way, the purpose of these things. We've had a nice rally so far in new crop prices. Am I jumping in with both feet today on January 12th? No, I'm not. I like to believe we'll have even a better shot, hopefully much better, but I'll take modestly better in that April, May, June period. And by the way, this Crystal Valley Co-op, I don't know if they know I'm using their numbers. I'm going to re-examine this myself. I find it very interesting. But they compared November soybean prices again to that spring insurance price, which is the average in the month of February. And in all 20 of the last 20 years, November futures have found a way to go even higher than that February average in a pretty broad period, March 1 all the way to November 30th. That should be less than November 30th because that November contract will expire before that. 19 of 20 years, the price rally was more than 20 cents higher than the February average. Dave, that is what I have.
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
going to stop the share and see if there's a question.
sure. Well, just to go back and summarize here based on the questions in terms of any quick comments about people with uncommitted corn at this point in time. I think you might have talked about that, but just do you have a summary guideline
Well,
to leave them with?
if you have uncommitted corn, I take it you're talking about unpriced corn.
Right. Yeah.
And I laid out that
Yeah.
we've had a nice rally into January. Right now, we are 60, 70 cents off our harvest, off our lows in the last 6 months. That's good. But I laid out the case that, yeah, we could see even higher prices in the April, May, June period. I guarantee nothing, Dave, but I'd like to believe the numbers point that we could do even better.
We got a quick question in here for you, and in your opinion, on how will the basis develop over the next 6 months? And I think we're talking primarily here on corn.
Yeah.
But in terms of you're looking out here, any opinions on that? Looking
Well,
out.
I do. I think this basis has softened up quite a bit in corn and soybeans. And it's all based on this rally in the futures price, which has raised prices, a new tax year. A lot of people have said, I've got to take advantage of that, got to get some cash going. And the buyers, I used to be a grain buyer, that when the grain comes easy, the basis backs off. This spate of selling will slow down. And I like to believe we will firm up the corn basis. Don't get wildly bullish on me, but we will firm up again when we get out into the May, June period.
Okay.
So I expect the basis to firm up again.
Last quick question is kind of this might be a little bit hard to pin down, but the question is in the form of exporting corn, besides the grain itself, but we export poultry and red meat that are consuming the corn. So what impact does that have in terms of, if you think about it, exporting that corn that's going out in another form, how is that impacting the market, or is that just too nebulous and hard to pin down?
Well, it's hard to put a number on it if you want
Yeah.
to put a number on it in terms of a percentage impact. Hell, we export ethanol. We export DDGs. Those are corn products too. All exports are good. That's all I'll say. All exports are good.
And last thing, there's a potential for one of the listeners about over like 4 million more acres of corn this year. Price thoughts on that supply, if that comes true, if farmers are actually going to do that, or if we're going to have potential of 4 millions or more. Is it supply and demand?
The person raising that is onto something. I think that soybean prices relative to production costs are in tougher shape than corn. And I think the corn belt will be leaning towards more corn, less soybeans. Could that have a detrimental effect on price by next fall? Absolutely. And that's why you have to pay attention to early selling opportunities over the next 5 months.
Okay. So I don't know, Ed, if you have to run away, if you could hold on for a little bit. I don't know your schedule today here.
I can hold on for a bit.
Well, we might have some more questions, and there are some more agronomic questions. But before we do that, I want to make sure we have time for there. So Adam, if you want to unmute yourself and join us here, Adam Birr, Executive Director, Minnesota Corn Growers Association here. And we asked Adam to come in a little bit on terms of what the Corn Growers Association is doing from the standpoint of developing markets, research, and some of the other things in his outlook and background. So Adam, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I just want to do a check here. Can you see my
Yep.
slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Well,
Yep.
I just thought, and I appreciate Jeff and Ed's comments, and I might touch on a couple of things that they brought up, and would encourage maybe here at the end we'll have a little time because I'd like to have a couple questions for them too, based on what they brought up. But I just want to take a moment to just highlight who we are. You know, we do refer to ourselves as Minnesota Corn. And that is two organizations, and we've heard both organizations mentioned already this morning. We have the membership side, which is the Minnesota Corn Growers Association. And by the way, we are the second largest corn membership organization in the country. Once in a while, we pop ahead of Iowa. We take pride in that throughout the year, and we strive to keep competitive with them. And then there's the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council, and that's the checkoff, of course. And, you know, we do work jointly, and a lot of the research we do helps inform some of our policy development and the things that we're doing there. The two really are linked, and the two organizations meet jointly and really do everything jointly. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think sometimes we throw out a lot of different organizations and names, and just like to clarify on that. And I do want to show too, this is in our annual report, and this just got mailed out. Hopefully everybody got a copy. We mail out 24,000 copies of our annual report to all of those that pay the checkoff. And thanks to all of those that are on that contribute to the checkoff. We try to steward that money very carefully. One thing to note, and it's really germane here, I think, is that we spend about 28% of the checkoff on research and utilization, and much of that goes to the University of Minnesota. And we are unique. If you look at the other state corn organizations, and not to criticize, or it's just an observation, this percentage is really high relative to a lot of state corn checkoffs. We also, of course, support our national organizations, you know, our export programs. I would say that's a piece, that 7%, that has probably increased and will increase more going into the future. And so those are just some of the things I wanted to highlight as far as how we invest that checkoff. And these percentages have been relatively stable, I would say, over the last five or more years. And then I'm just going to skip around here. This is a slide deck we use for kind of various purposes, an overview of the organization. But I wanted to come to the research one, and this has been kind of a long-standing goal in terms of our research, is to look at new and increasing uses of corn, to look at best practices that we really want to increase productivity. And so that's really, I think, germane, and Jeff talked on it as far as, you know, where can we incur some savings? And that's where a lot of our research is spent, with the soil fertility folks, with the agronomic folks, looking at places that we can increase that productivity, you know, get more out of those investments in our inputs. And you can see here some of the categories of research. We got the agronomics, genetics, pest management, soil fertility, water quality, livestock nutrition, biofuels, and new uses. And this just kind of shows a snapshot of where we're at today in terms of the projects that are in our current portfolio. And like I said, over $2 million going directly into research and outreach and education activities each year. You know, on the education and outreach, we do support Brad Carlson's position, and he does a wonderful job with the Nitrogen Smart program that Minnesota Corn is a big supporter of. We also support the Minnesota Ag Water Resources Center, and that includes the Discovery Farms program, where they're doing on-farm monitoring of what's coming off in terms of water quality, both subsurface and surface. Do a lot in the nutrient management space with Dr. Fabian Fernandez. We do a lot in the pest management space. Dr. Fei Yang is a relatively new addition to the agronomy department, and we've been invested in a couple of projects with him. We've got some irrigation projects that we invest in as well. And on the expanded uses side, though the number of projects might seem significantly fewer, I will say that the monetary investment in these is significant. And this is a space that really, we've probably the last 5 years invested with the Center for Sustainable Polymers at the University of Minnesota. It's over on the Minneapolis campus. We've got several projects with them looking at polymers, and that's an area, and I'll touch on it here later under utilization space that's kind of still, I think, blossoming. And that's what I wanted to highlight here on the utilization. Speaking of new uses, here's a couple of examples of some projects that we've invested in, and some of these are companies that have sort of spinned off of the Center for Sustainable Polymers. And so we got Valerian, Lacryl, all of these are looking at sort of green chemicals. And I will say, some of this isn't new. We've been investing in this for a long time, but we are starting to see where it's becoming sort of cost competitive with, oil is used and petroleum products are used in a lot of these products, but there's demand from the consumers and the companies to go more green. And that's sort of irregardless of what's happening relative to maybe state and federal policy. These are global companies. And so regardless of what's happening here, perhaps with regard to policy, the consumers are demanding these products. And so we are seeing, I think, competitive pricing, and that's where I think there's some real opportunities here for green chemicals moving into the future. I do want to highlight, ethanol is a significant part of our portfolio, both in terms of research as well as marketing. We've invested nearly $35 million in ethanol-related activities going back to 2008. We are the top blend rate in the country at 12.272% of our fuels in Minnesota using ethanol. We have more than 500 stations that offer unleaded 88, which is also the E15. And then, sales, this shows 2023 sales. We just got in 2024 sales, and those were nearly 143 million gallons of unleaded E15 sold in 2024. That's an 11.9% increase over 2023. And keep in mind, I think that we helped put the first E15 stations in about 10 years ago. And so it's just amazing how that has grown. I saw today at the Quick Trip, there's a 40 cent difference between unleaded 88 and the 87 octane. So you're getting that higher octane at a 40 cent premium, and certainly consumers are seeing the value there. Ed touched on trade, and that certainly, I'm not going to make any predictions either, only to say that I agree with what Ed says. I think right now, I would just caution in getting too excited about things. I think there's a lot of noise right now, and we'll kind of see where things settle out. The one thing that I mentioned, in some of the back and forth with Canada, there was a proposed tariff on potash, and Canada is a significant source of potash for us, and so that is something we're watching closely. But it does seem like these tariffs are used as a negotiating tool, and that's what we've seen in the past. And so we'll be careful to get too caught up. I think we'll see where things sort of settle out relative to that. But certainly corn, Mexico and Canada are significant trade partners for us. Like Ed said, on the ethanol side, with Canada going to sort of a 5% blend mandate and higher, they are becoming significant ethanol customers for us. And then we do work with a number of organizations. U.S. Grains Council, actually, many of our council members are down in Austin, Texas this week for a U.S. Grains Council delegate meeting and international marketing meeting. So we're very active in that. Some other organizations that we're active with relative to trade is the U.S. Meat Export Federation. And that question in the chat about how much corn do we export as poultry and red meat, I don't have the number at my fingertips, but USMEF does calculate for us sort of the added value of corn in those meat exports. And so I know our communications director is online here, and we'll be sure maybe to share that on social media, or we'll pass that along to you, Dave, because they do create some really nice graphics for us on the value of corn in those meat exports. We also get some nice graphics from Grains Council on the value of ethanol and DDGs exports as well. So we'll be sure to share those with you, because I just don't have those numbers at my fingertips. I think that probably were some of the things I wanted to touch on. I think, just coming back maybe to the grower side of things of the organization. There is some.
Adam, before you go, do you want to just mention a little bit about the bottom right-hand corner there, the screen new uses on SAF? Just touch on that a little bit.
Oh, sure, yeah. And I know you guys did a webinar on this here over Expo. Yeah. We're really excited about this. You know,
maybe
there's
explain
a lot of
what it is, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Sustainable aviation fuel is what it is, and you know they consider it anything that gets us to a carbon intensity value of half or more of traditional jet fuel. And we are part of this Sustainable Aviation Fuel Hub, which is being organized by Greater MSP, and there's a number of partners in there of interest, including Delta Airlines. In fact, the spokesperson for Delta Airlines came at our expo, and he's actually traveled around the Midwest. He attended North Dakota and South Dakota's expo events as well. And it's great to see an end user like Delta that's interested in sustainable aviation fuel. And they have set some pretty aggressive goals for incorporating SAF into their fuel supply. And they've got a relationship there with Flint Hills refinery, which is in our backyard there, Dave, in Rosemount, Minnesota. They actually have a direct pipeline that goes from the Flint Hills facility to the airport, and they are going to be set up to send blended product, SAF product, to the airport. And so it's a kind of a win-win-win for Minnesota, because we have the feedstock here. We've got the hub here with Delta, we've got the refinery, the blending. We just need to get the production, and that's something that we're working on, is try to increase the production of SAF, because that is the most limiting factor right now. They need billions of gallons, and right now we nationally, even globally, we're kind of in the hundreds of millions of gallons that we produce. So we've got some work to do there, but lots of promise there, lots of interest there. And I just wanted to touch on, relative to, some of the crop protection tools. That's an area that we're spending a lot of time on these days on the policy regulatory front. There's a lot of pressure on seed treatments using neonics on the state front. On the federal front, there's some pressures on crop protection tools like atrazine. I don't see that necessarily going away significantly, because a lot of that is driven by litigation. And so I think some of these regulatory frameworks actually provide maybe some protection against litigation, but those are some of the things that we're watching closely. I did see in the chat, how do the administration's changes in funding programs impact Minnesota Corn's research projects? We are a state checkoff. So nothing that has been proposed or to date impacts us, because the corn checkoff is set in state statute, and so we're not seeing any changes there. So I guess the only place that would impact us potentially is those projects that are getting federal grants that we match up against. And then I see too, how soon will SAF be produced in Minnesota and in the Midwest in general? It's a great question. There was a big announcement that GEVO is got funding to do a site in Sioux Falls. And then we do have GEVO has a presence down in Laverne, down in Southwest Minnesota too. And so it's starting to come online, but there's a lot of unknowns there around tax credits and things like this, as far as how that production is going to get up in place. So with that, maybe I'll pause, Dave, and if there's any questions, or if Jeff or Ed had any questions or anything to add what I said too.
Ed, you're the kind of the geographically the farthest away from us today here, but I don't know your schedule. Did you have any other comments or questions or anything else that Adam brought up, or anything else that you thought of that we didn't cover? You're muted, Ed. Yeah. There you go. You want to take off your mute, Ed? Okay.
I'm not
There we
real
go.
good managing this
Yeah.
stuff.
Okay.
I covered what I wanted to cover in terms of outlook for old crop and new crop prices. I am laser focused on and paying attention to trade issues and tariff issues because the potential impact is big, and let's hope it's not big.
Okay. I don't know anything else. There is an agronomic question or two. Jeff, I'm going to bring you back in here. And one of them, and I'm going to go from the latest here. And that was, there's a question, and we've had a lot of it. And we've had some out in the plots and so forth. Short-statured corn. Um, Anything that you've been involved with or read or agronomics, any opinions? I know we're out in the marketplace still early on number of acres, but any comments, observations that you might have on short-statured corn and its place on the landscape?
Yeah, I've done a couple trials on short-statured corn. Generally, the recommendation is short-statured corn prefers higher planting rates and narrower rows if they're possible. One of the issues with short-statured corn is the ear height, and the ear height can be exceptionally low on lower productivity soils like the hilltops, sandy areas, that type of thing. So it's the placement of those short-statured hybrids needs to be, in highly productive fields that have relatively uniform productivity and landscape position. The yield on them has been slightly less to similar when compared to the standard hybrids. In addition, the companies are recommending foliar fungicide on these. So I think that may be in part due to the high density of leaves being the same amount of leaves, but in a shorter plant. In addition, it may also be due to the disease packages on the hybrids. So that may be something to watch, but I would be cautious about using fungicide prophylactically on these, especially if you want to manage your costs. So definitely they have potential. I think the question is are they necessary for one's particular operation? So they're generally similar to regular corn until about the V6 stage, and then they start to appear shorter in size. And they have a larger root system than traditional corn.
There's a question that's actually for both Ed and Jeff here, but Ed, I'm going to go to you first, and it has to go to what we've experienced the last year or two, and that is low moisture conditions. And always I talk about La Nina and et cetera. We haven't had a lot of snowfall, and oftentimes I remember in the past, we were always talking about the fact that our April rains were really critical here, and Jeff too, a little in moisture. But let's say, for example, if we get into a low moisture situation, a little bit drier, in terms of corn prices, we live in a world market, but yet if we get dry in our I states in the upper Midwest and things go in there and that goes on, is that going to have a potential something to keep in mind on prices in terms of your marketing or what any? This is a real conjecture, obviously,
Yeah.
depending upon the weather here. But
The
let's say it's going to be dry. Yeah.
The short answer is yes. Yes. I mean, that's what drives markets higher.
Right.
That's why prices could rally in the spring. They don't rally for no reason. And I call the spring, Dave, I call it the tutu season. One year we're too early, the next year we're too late. One year we're too dry, the next year we're too wet. And that the planting of the crop happens once a year. We get uptight about it. And if things aren't perfect, and things are rarely perfect, we get uptight about the impact on yields and price. And absolutely, it's a big concern. I did hear a well-known weather guy do an outlook just a week ago in western Minnesota, and he'll tell you right away, I can't predict long term, but he sees some things shaping up that have him concerned about dry weather in the Corn Belt this season. But it's, he'd also emphasize time and again, it's too early to predict anything, but he sees some concerning patterns in the weather worldwide.
So pay attention to your marketing and opportunities and keep watching carefully. I guess, Jeff, if you think about it, if we're if we're going in, it's getting to be a dry spring, anything about planting time, planting depth, those types of things. If we run into that situation or concerns, if we're not, I mean, certainly we have it on a weed control basis on activation of pre-emergence, but just from the agronomic, any thoughts that you might have? Let's just say dry conditions at planting.
Yeah, well, generally dry spring conditions are great for agronomics. I mean, it allows us to get our work done, allows us more timely planting. The caveat is like a few years ago when we had excessively dry conditions at planting time. In those situations, you want to be thinking about trying to conserve moisture and also making sure the seed is placed into moisture at planting. So that, first off, that may mean planting at a 2.5-inch depth rather than a 2-inch depth for your corn. Another thing to think about may be things to try to conserve moisture, like limiting the amount of time between your pre-plant tillage and your planting, making sure it's done within a reasonable time and that it doesn't get extended longer than it needs to be.
Okay. We're going to go a little bit over time, and Ed, I know you understand this from your hockey interests and so forth. So, Adam, you can hang in there just a minute or two. But I did have one question that came in, and people have said I've heard that Brazil is quite dry, and that both the soybean and corn crop isn't the best. What have you heard? You're not what you predict. What have you heard?
They aren't the best, but they're still very good. And
Okay.
they're planting more every year. They're going to have bigger crops. And yes, there were earlier, a month or two ago, there were earlier concerns about dryness in Brazil and Argentina. I'm not saying their problems are all gone, but not unlike our own corn belt, we don't all produce to our maximum. We have issues here and there. Unfortunately for us last year, Minnesota was ground zero for not a great crop. If you're looking for relief from a small Brazil crop, you're going to have to look elsewhere. It's going to be a good sized crop.
Okay. Adam, anything else that you want to end with that you didn't touch
Yeah,
on based on this?
just a couple of things. One thing I neglected to mention is the export numbers are coming out for ethanol for the year, and we had a banner year for ethanol exports. So 1.91 billion gallons were exported from the U.S. in 2024. That was a great year, and so we hope we can continue to build on that. We're investing a lot in trying to build on that and marketing it to the world. And then the last thing I would just say is, when I came to Minnesota Corn, one of the tenets of the organization is they wanted to add value to the corn grown in Minnesota. So I can remember board members saying, we want to export pork chops and ethanol and DDGs. We don't want to export coarse grain. We want to add value to it here in Minnesota. It's always been a tenet of Minnesota Corn. And I saw that play out. I was attending my high school reunion back home in Michigan and visiting with some of my farmer friends, and they pulled up their basis, and Ed would appreciate this. In central Michigan, their basis at November was 75 cents under, and I pulled up our local ethanol plant, and I think we were at 25 cents under. And he said, Adam, I got nowhere to go with my corn. I got one place I can go with my corn. He says, I can't believe you have the 18 ethanol plants. And it just hit me as what that investment Minnesota Corn has made, and others too, and that all those processing options we have here, whether it be ethanol, a really vibrant livestock capacity in Minnesota. We have a great relationship with all of our livestock friends in Minnesota. And so that kind of hit home for me as far as what that has meant for marketing opportunities for corn growers in Minnesota.
Okay. Well, great. We had a couple of questions we didn't get to, but I'm going to make sure that they revolve into the next one, and some of them individually here about tillage on soybean stubble with anhydrous ammonia, and we will get back to Brett about that, and then also we'll talk about the seeding rates here in an upcoming one on terms of that with Seth Nave in terms of options. That's going to depend a little bit upon where you are in terms of that, but he can talk about in general of where if it's going to settle out between 130 and 150, or depending upon your risk management and so forth. With that, any last words? That's about all I have here from from this area. We did talk about the fact that this is being recorded. We actually run these strategic farmings every Wednesday. So we'll be back with folks again next week at this point in time. So we appreciate all of our speakers. Again, Ed, no matter where you are, taking the time to come with us, we do appreciate that, and Adam and Jeff as well. So again, thank you for attending. If you're attending in person, if you'd like the CEUs, we will put up the QR code for a extended period of time here. That'll be displayed, and you can use your CCA app, say for example, on your phone, and scan that with that. And or if you have other questions on CEUs, let us know. There's going to be a very short 3-question survey after you leave the session today, so please take a couple minutes to fill that out. It's much appreciated because that gives us information that we can plan for in the future. But really, we want to thank you. Thanks again to our sponsors, Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, and of course the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council as well, along with the Minnesota Extension. And so our next session again will be coming up here on February 19th, which will be a Wednesday again at 9 o'clock, and we will be pushing out information on our crops update and our other crops information, and in terms of that. And